Okay, we'll see.
Rules are rules, little girl.
We'll see if that works. I don't know exactly.
His feet all the time every time someone comes over and he doesn't sit, so.
All right, that looks good.
My husband.
This is my first podcast.
Not impression, not impression.
Yes,
All right.
send me a alarm now.
So I named it Quantum Creation, Understanding the Physics of Genesis, because we're really just going to stay in just the first 5 verses of Genesis, because there's so much in there that well, it'll take up enough time. Yeah. So I'll just go ahead and we'll read the first verses, or the first 5 verses to start us out, and then we'll get into a little bit about like parallelism, which is a literary, poetic element, and we'll see how it all gets impacted from those first 5. So probably like what the second most popular verse in the Bible is "Let there be light." I would say the first one is "For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son." But so yeah,
My favorite is By Your Stripes.
wasn't popular though. All right, so Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 through 5 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day." So, switching gears a little bit, parallelism, it is a literary technique that instead of rhyming sounds, it rhymes ideas. I'm just going to read right from here. So there are many forms and types of parallelism. Some forms of parallelism compare and contrast ideas using literal concepts, while others use imagery and figurative language to create a visual representation of a thought or idea. And so a few examples are emblematic parallelism, where one word renders figuratively the literal meaning of another. And I should have had these examples pulled out, but let me do that real quick. In this case, it would be like, I think Proverbs 25:13, it talks about God being as refreshing as like a cool glass of water or something. So there's kind of like the symbolic parallelism between the refreshing nature of God compared to a cool drink. Let me see, Proverbs 25, verse 13. Yeah. Oh, okay. "A messenger you can trust is just as refreshing as cool water in the summer." So relating the concept of a cool glass of water being refreshing to the refreshing ability to be able to trust someone with a message. Synonymous parallelism, the repetition of one idea in successive lines. The first half will make a statement, and the second half will say the same thing in different words. So if we're staying in Proverbs, and we went to chapter 3, sorry for the delay. Uncle Jay, break the silence for me.
See, it's like the jokes now.
All right, sorry. So Proverbs chapter 3 verse 11, it says, "My child, don't turn away or become bitter when the Lord corrects you. The Lord corrects everyone He loves, just as a parent corrects a child they dearly love." So they parallel the same idea, but using saying the same thing just with different words.
Read it again one more time.
It says, "My child, don't turn away or become bitter when the Lord corrects you." And then it's actually verse 12 says, this is the parallel, "The Lord corrects everyone He loves, just as a parent corrects a child they dearly love." So the first verse, 11, talked about the Lord correcting His children. And then in verse 12, it parallels the same idea, saying essentially the same thing in different words, saying that the Lord corrects everyone he loves, just as a parent corrects a child they dearly love.
Gotcha.
So then, antithetical parallelism, at least I believe that's how you pronounce it, antithetical, brings together opposing ideas in marked contrast. Instead of saying the same thing twice, it says two different things to illustrate the same idea. So if we went to Proverbs chapter 19, it would say, verse 16, obey the Lord's teachings and you will live. Disobey and you will die. So if you obey, you live. If you disobey, you die. There's a parallelism between the two. If you go to the last page in the packet, it'll go with this next paragraph. This is super cool. This is my favorite form of parallelism that I found. And it's an example of external parallelism where there's a main idea and it gets repeated in the inverse order in which it was entered, all focused around the same idea. So the story of Noah, the entire story itself, is a form of parallelism, external parallelism. If you look, it starts up at the top with A. It starts with introducing Noah into the story. At the very center of the story, where God remembers Noah when he's on the ark, is, what is that, P? So it starts with Noah. The very middle of the story is Noah. And then in the exact order of which everything was introduced, it gets inversely, not reintroduced, but inversely mentioned until it ends with Noah. So it's the story is kind of mirrored, starts and begins and is mirrored around Noah. So that's the form of external parallelism. And then all the parables that Jesus used, they were a form of symbolic parallelism, where the concepts or the items in his parables, they represented a spiritual truth using a literal or a physical example. So all this is to say that the Bible, Scripture, is littered with different forms of parallelism. Some are obvious and some are not so obvious, and it's really up to us to try and figure it out, or at least study it to be able to see it where it is. And when we look into the first 5 chapters of Genesis, I don't know if there's really an official type of parallelism or a name for it, but I tried calling it homonymous parallelism, because homonym is one word that has 2 meanings. And so I'm just going to go into the rest of it, so we'll figure it out. But
Okay, cool.
yeah, I'm going to go back to reading this now. So when we understand that the story of creation too contains a homonymous-like parallel structure, then we can see that God was trying to expose the science behind quantum physics thousands of years before it even had a name. So, going into verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there's not a whole lot to say about this, except that it's used as a topic sentence that kind of introduces the chapter. And there's a cool article I found online, and it talks about how the way that this was structured in the Hebrew, when they translated it, it actually translates pretty literally. Like the Hebrew word for in the beginning was first, and then Hebrew word for God creating was second, and then the Hebrew word for heavens and the earth, they all followed after. But if you were to follow the actual Hebrew the rules of literature for how it applies to their language, they say that the most important thing always comes, or not always, but usually comes first in a sentence. And in this case, the most important thing would have been God. And so it would have been proper to say, God in the beginning created the heavens and the earth. But because God, by virtue of how they structured the sentence, was not first, they're saying he's not the most important part of what this sentence is trying to say. Not to say that he's not the most important thing. It's just for what this sentence is trying to tell us is that the most important thing is in the beginning, because it denotes a sequential order of things.
Mhm.
So when it starts out to say, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, they're saying pay attention to the order of how everything is listed, because that is what the main takeaway is within the chapter. And then this is the breakdown that kind of goes into the explanation upon that, if you want to get real into the Hebrew rules of grammar and literature. But I'll save that for your guys' time if you want to. So in verse 2, the primordial environment. So the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So when it says the earth was without form and void, it refers to the particles that existed but were not yet bonded. And it does not refer to the earth as the planet that we know it and exists today. Without form and void illustrates a disjointed swarm of particles being referred to as the earth. And it may be better understood if we said the composing matter that would become the earth was without form and void. And so, because of the use of waters, I think a lot of times we tend to think that the earth was already existent, but maybe it was just submerged in like literal H2O. But based upon the context of the first 5 verses here, I believe it to say something completely different, which is that it's all the particles that would make up the atoms and the structure of matter and material before they actually took form. So, darkness is just the absence of light. So the earth was without form and void, and there was plenty of darkness, or in fact, it was all darkness. It was over the face, and the face, the Hebrew word for face there is panium, and if you use the Strong Concordance, it's number H6440, and that is used in a great variety of applications, literally and figuratively, and based upon the context of the verse here, it just makes more sense to say that it refers to a countenance or an appearance, because obviously a voided, formless structure doesn't have a literal face. So they're just saying that this vast expanse of nothingness, the appearance of it was dark, because it says the darkness was over the face of it. And then of the deep is Tehom, I believe it's pronounced, and the Strong's number for that is H8415, and that literally translates to an abyss, as a surging mass of water. So what Moses was trying to communicate in the first part of verse 2 is that the pre-creation atmosphere existed in a state of free-flowing, disconnected, incoherent matter that was shrouded in complete and utter darkness. And then the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The Hebrew word for waters there is mayim, Strong's word H4325, and there's 2 different ways you could translate that. It could be either literal water, or figuratively, we see a lot of examples where it means just kind of like a juice. That was one of the actual definitions it gave, or a mixture. I actually Googled juice, and the definition was the liquid or moisture contained in something. So if we were to think of the waters in a figurative sense, we would say that it was the liquid or moisture that contained the preformed matter that would soon be made into the earth. Is everyone following this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like juice, like I said, the liquid or moisture contains something like
Or
an orange juice. It's the juice, the liquid,
Yeah.
it's an orange.
It really comes together towards the end, so it'll all make sense, I promise.
Yeah, orange juice.
So the inherent quality of a thing. Oh, that was the second part of the definition of juice. The inherent quality of a thing, or the essence. So the context of this verse, along with the plural sense of the word, suggests that waters is not literal H2O, but it's a figurative use of the word. So everything was existent in one form or another, but it didn't have the physical form that it has today as we see it in an organized sense. It was all just kind of mishmash, messy stuff. So then verse 3 is where creation actually begins, and it says, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." And so I think we talked about this a while back, about what light is. So, little refresher. Light is electromagnetic radiation of any wavelength, whether visible or not. And the difference between light and visible light, I guess there's really not a difference, because visible light is light. It's just a smaller portion of the spectrum it's visible to the naked eye. And if you cared about the wavelength, it would be between 380 and 740 nanometers. So then other forms of light or electromagnetic radiation include gamma rays, which are nuclear explosions, and they have a high frequency and a short wavelength, which means that there's a lot of waves in a shorter span of time, which means there's a whole lot more energy in there. Or we have things like radio waves, which are what we get our signal for traditional AM and FM radios, and those are a lower frequency, longer wave, and therefore they have lower energy, which is why they're harmless to us. But nuclear energy would be pretty harmful. Yeah. So through this, we have to remember that light and electromagnetic radiation is used interchangeably because it is the same thing. So light equals electromagnetic radiation, and because electromagnetic radiation is a frequency, it's also fair to say that it is a frequency, and because frequencies are just traveling energy, it could also be called energy. All those four terms, you're essentially describing the same thing. So why is light so significant? Because frequencies, which light is, do something really cool to liquids. And remember that the pre-light conditions, as noted in verse 2, refer to the earth and presumably the entire universe as a deep, vast, empty liquid. And it's also important to remember that the light referenced in verse 3 cannot be considered light from the sun, moon, or stars because they were not created until day 4 of creation, which is verses 14 through 19. Does everyone remember the video that I showed about the hose, the water in the hose?
Yeah, that was so
Mhm.
cool.
Did everyone see that?
Mm.
Okay. You didn't see it?
I was
Should we put it on the TV or should we show you after?
look at it later.
You can show that.
After, okay. So there was, just
Unless
for
you want to see
refreshers,
It doesn't matter, I'm good either way. But it was just so cool.
after? No?
We all have fun.
Google it? Alright, Sam will Google it.
Okay.
While she's YouTubing it, it was the hose was hooked up, it was like duct taped to the speaker, and he had the frequency generator, and when he hit certain frequencies, the water took a completely different, unnatural shape, and it just stayed in that shape too, until he changed the frequency, and it kind of jived around a little bit.
What is it called? Is it the UN90Y5?
Yeah, if you go or YouTube like water resonance, water frequency, do water frequency. Yeah, water frequency experiment. And then this one.
Do I need the volume up or no?
Are we gonna try and show everyone or?
What, I'll do this.
Oh.
I'll see if I can.
Oh, you're gonna. You really only need to see like the first 45 seconds. If that-
That's pretty cool. So where's the frequency coming from?
Oh, he's got a frequency generator, probably up to a laptop or something, and he's just running it to a speaker. And the speakers, or the hose, that poly tube, it's
Yeah.
just being hung over the speaker. So the speaker is generating the frequency into the tube of the water. And as it pours out, you see that the frequency actually dictates the shape of the water without any other constraints, except for just the frequency itself causing it to do crazy things. That's really all I need to see to get the main gist of it.
I wonder if Penny could hear that frequency loudly. She's
Yeah.
acting like that.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Dogs do hear the different frequencies. They, you know, the dog whistles that only they can hear. Or,
That's right.
so
Must
I
have a
bet
higher
it was,
range.
yeah. So I'm sure that the frequency was a little bit higher.
I think-
She probably did hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, obviously that wasn't light in the video, it was just sound frequencies, but it's still to show the relationship between frequencies and liquids, that it has the power to manipulate it in really cool ways that wouldn't be natural. So not only do the frequencies manipulate liquids, but they also create more complex arrangements the higher the frequency is. And so I think we also watched the sand plate, where they had the metal plate, yeah, and the sound generator underneath it, and they sprinkled like sand or salt on it.
Oh, that was so cool.
Yeah, and you pointed out how it looks like different crop circles sometimes.
Yeah.
You see, yeah.
Yeah.
And what was cool about that is there are different thresholds. When they started at a low frequency and they got to a certain point, it would create a really cool organized shape or pattern. And then as they increased it, it would start to get messy. And then they would hit the next threshold and the shape or the pattern was slightly more complex. And then when they got to the next one, it was even more complex. And the higher the frequency got, the more complex the
like
pattern.
geometric shapes
Yeah.
and everything. With
Yeah.
it. It's on the next one if you want to look for that, just to look it up, but it is pretty cool.
It's neat. That's just sound resonance. If you were to Google or YouTube search like sound resonance.
You don't hear anything like that.
Oh.
Well, they usually play
No,
like a
me too.
background thing.
Yeah, but yeah, we can watch it after. So we can now start to see the science behind creation begin to take shape in just the third verse of Genesis, with corroborating evidence outside of Scripture. And I thought this was really cool. There's a guy named James. I don't know how Quach. How would you pronounce that? That's so funny. What?
Sorry. Quack? Quack?
Quack.
Quack?
Quack?
It must be French. It's just, yeah.
Yeah.
it must be-
Yeah, well, we'll just say it's
Yeah.
French.
Anyway. This dude named James, he's a lead physicist out of the University of Melbourne, and him and his team, they theorized that the Big Bang model should actually be modeled after a phase change, so as in a liquid turning into a solid. So they describe the beginning of the universe as
Honey.
liquid space-time, which cooled and crystallized and it expanded like water does when it freezes into ice. And the result is the 3 spatial and 1 time dimension that we see today. So in like quantum physics, the the commonly agreed upon or understood model for like everything physical is that it's 3D space-time, meaning that space has 3 dimensions: length, height, and width. And then there's time, which is only a 1 dimension. So, being that it's only 1 dimension, it's not linear. So it'd have to be 2 dimensions for it to have, a left and right per se. If you were to look on a graph to move around, but because it's only 1 dimension, time is really kind of just a concept as
This is why
opposed to
we're
a
taking
reality.
this.
Yeah.
So we can,
We get more into that later though. But what's cool about James's theory is that the Big Bang Theory has mainly 3 big problems that what we observe in physics and in the universe today, there's no reconciling it to the Big Bang. Like one of the instances, they actually think that the universe is flat when they look at it. Not to say that it's perfectly flat, but it's more flat than it is spherical. And so if everything started from an explosion, then it would explode out in every direction, but it doesn't appear that the universe is that way. The second one is the horizon problem, which is when they look out to different galaxies at the edge of the universe, or at least as far out as we can see and stuff. They find that if everything started at an explosion, it would move from really fast, and as it expands out, it would lose energy and slow down. But they're finding that certain parts of the universe out at a distance are moving faster than other spaces that are closer towards what would be the center, so it doesn't really line up. And also there's a temperature thing with that too, where the temperature, as it loses energy, it should cool, but they're finding it's hotter out more as opposed to in more. So there's different problems with the Big Bang Theory, but because of the phase change theory, it doesn't claim that the universe started from a center point and worked its way outward. It's not troubled by those three things that we witness happening in the universe. And it also opens up the we're gonna get into that. So forget I said that last part. So when God said let there be light, he was really saying let there be electromagnetic radiation. Which brings us to verse 4, which is matter versus dark matter. And so God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So matter, or what we'll call regular matter, is matter that we're used to, which is any substance that has mass and takes up space by having volume. And matter is generally includes atoms and anything made up of them. And then an atom is the basic unit of matter and the defining structure of elements. And then we have the atomic structure down there, like from science class in school and stuff. And there's 3 different particles that make up a single atom. There's the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons. The protons and the neutrons, they're stuck together by something called the strong force, which we don't really even know what it is, so no one could really say. But they're held together and they make the nucleus, and then there's electrons that orbit around that nucleus, and depending on what the atom is, like what element it is, there's different quantities of electrons, but they all orbit around the nucleus in a very consistent orbital fashion. So they are positively, negatively, and neutrally charged also, which is a big deal because electromagnetic radiation is what gives them their charges, and that's why they named them proton, neutron, electron, based upon the charge of the atom. The proton is positively charged, the neutron has no charge, and the electron is negatively charged. So the electromagnetic attraction and repulsion of the charged particles maintains the energy of the atom. It's what causes those electrons to orbit in the consistent manner that they do without going off into space somewhere or without crashing into the nucleus. So the atoms are the basic units or building blocks of all matter. Atoms are held together by electromagnetic radiation or electromagnetic energy. Electromagnetic energy and electromagnetic radiation are the same thing as light. So we are, as is everything that physically exists, a product of light, because light, electromagnetic radiation, holds atoms together, and everything is made out of atoms. So since the energy contained within the atom is electromagnetic energy, it's fair to say that all matter is not just held together by light, but is actually a form of light. And when explaining Einstein's theory of relativity, Brian Koberling of Universe Today goes as far as say that light and matter are just aspects of the same thing. Matter is just frozen light, and light is matter on the move. Oh wait, and let that bedazzle our brains for a second.
Yeah, and even like the scripture says, you know, God is light, and in him there is no darkness. I mean, God is made of light, and everything in heaven is made of light.
Yeah.
Light is the source.
Yeah. I read that when I was doing some research for all this stuff, they said that some scientist somewhere created matter from light. Which, if you think about it, it makes sense in light of like all this, you know?
Yeah, right. That's how everything was created.
Yeah.
Spoken.
Yeah. So that is regular matter, but then there's also something called dark matter, which, unlike normal matter, dark matter does not interact with the electromagnetic force, meaning it does not absorb, reflect, or emit light, which makes it extremely hard to detect. And we're only able to detect dark matter by the gravitational effects that it has on normal matter. And regular matter only accounts for 5% of the universe, while dark matter accounts for 95%. I shouldn't say dark matter because there's a difference between dark matter and dark energy, but the two of them combined make up 95% of the universe. So I thought it was interesting because scripture says that there's an unseen world known as the spirit world that is invisible to the physical sense, but is very real and interacts with the physical world. And we could read about in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10 through 13 about how we do not war against, was it physical?
Flesh and blood.
Yeah.
Principalities against powers.
Right. So there's a unseen spiritual world, but it interacts with the physical, is what scripture says. But what science says is that there's an invisible and physically undetectable form of matter existing called dark matter, and it's only detectable due to its gravitational effects on regular matter, which is essentially the same exact thing as what scripture says. Scripture also says that God, who is a spirit, cannot be contained by the physical world, and therefore the spiritual world has to be bigger and greater than the physical world. And then again, the physical matter only accounts for less than 5% of the mass in the entire universe. So
Well, that makes sense this way, because right, heaven and everything else, the spiritual realm, it would be that much bigger than the 5% of the earth.
yeah,
You know what I mean?
right.
So, yeah, that makes sense.
So scripture and science say a lot of things, and a lot of things tend to line up
Yeah.
when you just see it in the right context.
The only thing is, I just don't like the term calling the spiritual world dark matter.
Well,
I'm thinking Star Wars.
that's where you got to think of the difference between the parallel between light and dark. The only reason they call it dark matter is because
Absence of that.
the absence of electromagnetic radiation. Yeah. But the parallel, the spiritual, if this was like a Jesus parallel, the light would represent something, and the dark would represent something else. So yeah. But we can make up another name for it. Not light matter.
There you go.
What about like unseen?
Yeah,
Unseen
unseen,
matter.
yeah.
Unseen matter,
Unseen
yeah.
matter. What? What are you gonna name it? On water?
On water.
How about orange juice?
So verse 4.
Yeah.
Verse 4, and God saw the light, or the electromagnetic radiation, and that it was good, and God separated light, or matter produced from electromagnetic radiation, from the darkness, or dark matter, which does not interact with light. So, from a scientific or a quantum mechanical standpoint, verse 4 says exactly what we see electromagnetic radiation doing in the physical world. It separates matter from dark matter. Electromagnetic radiation or light was the dividing force that separated matter from dark matter, or otherwise stated, light from darkness. So verse 4 proves out perfectly true in the quantum mechanical context. Verse 5 is the first introduction of the term day. So God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. So God essentially called electromagnetic radiation day because light is electromagnetic radiation. So if he's calling the light day, he's calling electromagnetic radiation day. And the Hebrew word for day, Strong's number 3117, is yom, and it's from an unused root word. And I don't even know what they mean by unused root word, because why would you have a word if you don't use it? But anyway, from an unused root word meaning to be hot, a day as in the warm hours. So literally, throughout Scripture, we see it meaning a day, sunrise to sunset or sunrise to sunrise. The literal definition would be sunrise to sunset, because that would be the hot portion. Or figuratively, and this is all coming from Strong's Concordance also, figuratively a day could be a space of time defined by an associated term. So calling the light day, it makes perfect sense beyond just the traditional sense, because when remember that light is electromagnetic radiation, radiation is frequency, frequency is energy, and a high energy equals a high heat. If we take the literal sense to be hot, then you're assuming that when the energy that it took to create everything, it would have to be pretty high energy, so it would have to be pretty hot, which I thought was a cool parallel. So, this is where I kind of get torn. I don't know if I'm torn or just still unsure, because I don't think that it couldn't be a literal 24-hour day when they talk about, the first day or the second day. But I also think that there's so much more to it, that it's not just meant to define a period of time in terms of hours. And so when we get into like the figurative element of it, so reasons that I could see it not meaning a literal 24-hour day is because the sun, the moon, the stars, which are based off of, or the solar day is based off of, they didn't exist until the fourth day. So without them, there's no reference to time in the first day of creation.
Right.
So, and we get into it again, but again, time is more of a concept that's based upon a reference. So, not to say that it couldn't take a reference from day 4 and apply it to day 1, but without the reference point being there, it's not as obvious, I guess. So anyway, the sun, moon, the stars, which make up our calendar, or they help us keep track of our calendar, and that's where we get our solar day from, they didn't exist. And then, so linear time, this is where we get into the whole concept of time. Linear time is more of a concept than a physical reality. The accepted model of space-time, like I said earlier, it consists of 3-dimensional space and 1-dimensional time. And with 1-dimensional time, it means you don't move forward or backward, because you don't have left or right. You just have one point, so you can't move either way to the side because it's only one dimension. So linear time, the concept that time has multiple points is thought to be a concept that was invented by our brains in order to help us cope with the changes in our environment. Or put another way, in the physical world, change is real, but time is not. And time is only a reflection of change.
Well, they say like, you know, God is outside of time.
Yeah.
You know, you hear that,
Yeah,
that there is no time, it's just what we're,
right,
at least
yeah.
I think we're experiencing.
One, like a thought experiment that I had that I thought kind of helped put it in perspective was, like, if you imagine that you were just floating in a vast white area where everything around you was white, up, down, left, right, everything was just white, and it was just you floating there, and you have no depth perception because you have no reference points. And you saw in the distance, a train, and if the train was coming straight at you, you wouldn't really notice it moving at all. If anything, the closer it got, it might look bigger. But let's say, for the sake of the thought experiment, the train would shrink proportionately to how close it got to you so that it stayed the same size. The train would still be traveling closer to you, but it would look as if it was just standing still because of your vantage point of it. And so it would appear that time, if someone told you that train's moving but it didn't look like it was moving, it would appear to stand still because you don't have the reference point for the change in it. But if you saw the change, or if you saw the train from the side angle, no matter how far away it was, you would see it going left or right. And so it would appear to move, and so for every bit or piece that it moved, you could say time's going by because I see this train moving. And both ideas, the train is moving, so change is happening, but the first one, you don't have a reference point to judge time by. So that's what they're saying, is that time isn't a real thing, it's just a concept that helps us cope with the changes in our environment.
Makes sense.
It's like
cool.
it's
Is
like
it?
watching your kid grow
Yeah.
too, almost, you know, because like that all of a sudden happens. You know, you're looking, I'm like, oh my gosh, like
Where'd the
Chloe's-
time go?
yeah,
Have
where'd the
you
time
ever-
go?
Have you ever seen, like, every so often it'll pop up on Facebook where a guy takes a photo of himself every single day for 365 days, and you see the changes that his body. I think that's pretty cool. That kind of I don't know if it has anything close to it, but that's kind of how I
Get it in
think
there.
of it. You know?
Yeah. There's also the one, when I had the balloon and I like tried drawing the lines around the balloon 2 different ways to show the graphs. And then when I blew up the balloon just a little bit, if you were to take an object on the perimeter of the balloon and move it at a constant speed, it would take, I don't know, 5 seconds to go from one side to the other. But if you blew the balloon up and you kept that same constant speed, it would take, you know, proportionately longer for how much bigger the balloon got. And the grids on the balloon were supposed to represent space-time, because space-time is, it's kind of like in a Rubik's Cube, if you think of it, like solid space-time. And the reason objects have gravity is because the object is pushing on space-time, and space-time is pushing back. So gravity, or what keeps us on the Earth, is actually space-time pushing down on you. And because the Earth is displacing space-time, they're fighting for that space. That's why it keeps us there. And they did the experiment with the airplanes where they were at different like altitudes, and they flew different, I don't know if it was the same path, but they had an atomic clock set and they took like the same route, but the clock showed that the one airplane being by like a different altitude was slightly earlier than the other one, because the effects of space-time wasn't as great because it was outside of the strongest point of gravity. And so the change that occurred, I gotta think of my thoughts here. It all happened at the same time from like our perception on Earth. Like you could still see like there's an airplane going there, an airplane going there, but technically the airplane that was higher up, it aged quicker because it had less effects of space-time on it.
Yeah.
So if we lived really high up in the air, we wouldn't age as quickly.
Theoretically.
Is that the secret to
Yeah.
being young?
Higher altitude.
Higher altitudes.
But the whole, if I could try and bring it back in, when they landed at the same time and stuff, like, nothing had changed from their perception to each other and what was going on. So, like, in terms of time, they were at the same point in time doing the same thing. It was just the perception or the reference to the environment around them that really changed, not time itself. Is that making sense? Because I'm not even sure if I'm following
Well,
it
yeah,
myself.
the atomic clock
Yeah, the
wasn't gonna be
atomic
different.
clock was
Yeah,
different.
yeah, the atomic clocks were
Right,
different, yeah.
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 So all that to say that time is kind of just a concept to help us cope with the changes in our environment. So, back to verse 4 still? Yeah, I think. Back to verse 5, I'm sorry. If we take into account the two pieces of information regarding the sun, moon, the stars not being there, and how time is more of a concept than a fact, interpreting a day to mean one solar day or 24-hour period, it's not ruled out, but the waters are kind of muddy. And so if we examine the term day in the figurative context, then we can connect some pretty interesting dots. The Hebrew word for day, or yom, appears in all 7 days of creation, including the 7th day of rest. But unlike each day before it, the 7th day is the only day that is not said to have been completed. So, in days 1 through 6, it says in the evening and the morning were the first day, the evening and the morning were the second day, and it puts a conclusion on those days, but on the 7th day, it never says that. It just says on the 7th day, God rested. And so most theologians agree that the fact that the phrase that the evening and the morning were the whichever day, the fact it doesn't appear on the 7th day indicates that we're still living in the 7th day of creation and will be until the day of Christ's return. So therefore, the term day as used in the 7th day of creation is used figuratively, not as a 24-hour sense, but just as a period of time defined by an associated term. All right, so if you take it figuratively and not a literal 24-hour day, then there has to be an associated term to help us understand whatever is trying to be communicated. And when we look at the first reference to what a day is, the reference or the associated term is light, because God called the light day. So if a day is a period of time defined by the electromagnetic frequency on the first day of creation, then we could conclude that the 7 days of creation are referencing a specific frequency of electromagnetic energy that manipulates matter. And the resonance plate video is a perfect example of the different frequencies producing different results.
And that's the one with the sand?
Yeah.
Okay.
The higher the frequency, the more complex the. So, presumably, when God says, and the evening and the morning were the first day, he's saying that was the first frequency, or maybe the first set of frequencies that created matter. And then when he gets into the second day and he talks about how he divided the waters, he's saying that the second day is the second frequency or the second set of frequencies that divided the water. And so it's a associated term to electromagnetic frequencies, not necessarily a 24-hour period. So, to continue verse 5, the second part of it, it says, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. So evening is one of those homonyms in the Hebrew. The word Ereb, if you look in the Strong's Concordance, it's H6153 and 6154, and they're the same word with two meanings, one meaning evening or night or post sunset, and the second one means to braid or intermix. So if you imagine, I don't know what element has two electrons, but I don't know, maybe it's hydrogen or something. I don't even know.
Hydrogen, I think.
About
was-
Hydrogen
H2O,
one.
Yeah.
hydrogen, two hydrogens and one oxygen.
Yeah.
Water,
Right,
H2O.
yeah,
There's
that's what I was
two,
thinking.
two waters,
Oxygen.
two
Hydrogen.
or hydrogens
Yeah.
and one oxygen.
It's good.
That's where if you, in order to have, you gotta have two hydrogens, one oxygen to create H2O.
But you have two different elements in there.
Two
Oh, I see what you're saying.
different. I don't know.
Two atoms of hydrogen versus one atom of oxygen, yeah, I see.
Helium. So if you were to look at a single helium atom, it's got two protons and two neutrons at its nucleus. And then it would have two electrons, because the electrons match the protons. So it would have two electrons just orbiting the nucleus in a consistent orbit. And so, using my hands, I guess, try and, how would that even, I feel like when they tell you to try, yeah, you do one and I'll do the other.
One going this way, one going that.
Yeah, or like this almost, right?
Or it's
Like that, we'll do this way. If the cup is the center, and they orbit like that, yeah, that's what I want right there.
Okay.
So then, that would be the electrons orbiting the nucleus. But then, when you braid something, if you have a 3-corded braid, like Chloe tries to ask me to braid her hair sometimes, and I do horrible at it, but I know enough about how it's supposed to go. You have 3 strands of
You
hair,
always want a new one.
and you always take the outside one and you move it into the center. And so you make the same orbital type pattern braiding as you would of 2 electrons orbiting a nucleus.
Interesting.
So when it says, and there was evening, you could take it as literal evening, like evening hours, or because it's a homonym, it could take the meaning of braid or intermix. So when you get to morning, which is the word boker, I believe it's pronounced, Strong's word H1242, it refers to morning as in pre-dawn or daybreak, and then it also gave break of day itself as the secondary description. And it derives from the word bakar, which means to break forth or admire. So if the morning means daybreak, the day is breaking forth, and if day is light, and remember light is electromagnetic energy or electromagnetic radiation, then morning is when the light is breaking forth. And when we remember that when God said, let there be light, the light separated light, because all matter is made up of light, it separated it from the dark matter. You could say that the light broke forth out of dark matter. Also, side note, just to think about, is that if the word day means to be hot, literally, the evening and the morning, those are the cold hours of the day. Because the actual definition in Strong's Concordance, it says the evening is the moment at sunset and beyond, and then the morning, it refers to the early morning hours before the day breaks. So it's actually the opposite of the hot hours, it's the cold hours of the day. And then first, So there was evening and there was morning, and that was the first day. The word Echad is the word that they use for first, and it stresses unity or oneness, but it recognizes diversity. Atoms are diverse in structure and composition, but as a whole, they create a single piece of matter, and millions of different atoms come together to make different types of compounds. And this type of unity and oneness out of diversity is the very definition of the Hebrew word Echad, and its usage is likely very intentional. Moses could have very easily used the word pa'am, which refers to a single step in a process in terms of like a sequential process. And that probably, if you're just looking at steps in a sequence, pa'am would have been the more logical choice, but he intentionally used Echad, it might be Echad, but either way, it gives more context to the hidden parallels between the quantum mechanics of what was actually happening in creation compared to just a single step in a sequence. So then, when we try and add the quantum mechanical definition of everything that's being said in Scripture, and we try and apply it in that light, if we were to translate it, it would say, and there was braiding and intermixing of particles and atoms, and there was light, or electromagnetic radiation, breaking forth, and that was the first electromagnetic frequency. The first day of creation consisted of God speaking and creating electromagnetic energy, the force that holds atoms together, and this produced all the physical matter in the universe that God would continue to manipulate via new frequencies or new days in order to create and sustain all that we see today. So in just the first 5 verses of the Bible, we see a brilliant example of literary poetry that was thousands of years before its time, and God uses the ordinary and obvious concepts of light and day and masterfully creates a type of homonymous parallel to the quantum mechanics of creation. The 7th day of creation, which has not ended, is the sustaining electromagnetic frequency that was spoke out of the mouth of God and maintains our very existence. So even today, because electromagnetic energy holds everything together, there's still that frequency. And Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3, it says, the sun is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And then my final thoughts regarding it, and I thought there were some cool parallels between just the physics of it and also the spiritual aspect of it, is when you consider light in creation, it received its direction from God because God said, let there be light, and then light happened and did what God told it to. It created something out of the void and empty space of what was there, and then it drives out or it separates the darkness. And in Matthew chapter 5 verses 14 through 16, it says that you are the light of the world. So when we apply it to our lives, spiritually speaking, we are to receive our direction from God, create something out of the voids and empty spaces in our lives or even lives of others, and to drive out darkness, which I thought was pretty cool.
That's very cool. You could write a book. This is awesome.
Thank you. I confuse myself when I try and read it.
Wow.
And that's all I have.
Wow. We want more.
Thank you.
Keep going on with this. This is
Yeah.
awesome.
Thanks.
So, yeah, and I know even like with the light thing, they say